Petrus, we're back again with the African disease. How bad is this to Africa's reputation as a good place for, with democratic credentials and improving?
Good evening. I think firstly we must recognize that the Ivory Coast's political situation has been very precarious for several years now. This election that was held now this year has already been postponed since 2005. President Gbagbo has on several occasions proven himself to be quite reluctant to let go of power. And now the very dramatic events of this last week proves the point that even though the Electoral Commission announced that 54.1% went to Mr. Ouattara, the opposition candidate, the problem is that President Gbagbo just flatly refuses to recognize the vote. And this also is important, this very quick reaction of the African Union, which recognized the outcome of the vote and has now dispatched President Thabo Mbeki, or former President Mbeki, to the country.
And I suppose what this does is, of course, expose Africa's weakest points. And in this case, the institutions. Clearly, our institutions are not designed to ensure that these processes take place without problems.
You see, the issue that we must bear in mind here is that there's an interesting thing on the continent, in the sense that on the one hand we do have very regular elections that happen, but the problem is when you get to the ultimate conclusion of the political process, it's like that point of having to clinch the deal and accept the fact that an opposition candidate has been voted into office, accept defeat and step down and play another kind of role within that society. I don't know if it's necessarily only a problem of institutional weakness. We must also recognize we come through very severe and deep conflicts. So you're still dealing, in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, you're dealing with memories of a civil war, a very deep social division between the northern and southern region of the country based on religion and other factors like that. So you need a very careful and a very well thought through strategy to blend those societies together and to maintain peace. So it's actually a very big task that African leaders are faced in these situations.
Does Mbeki have a chance, do you think?
Excuse me?
Does Mbeki have a chance at succeeding in trying to heal these divisions?
Yes, he has a history. While in the time that he was president of South Africa, he was involved in a mediation effort. That effort did stall, unfortunately, at a certain point in time, and then he also withdrew. Now in the capacity or being sent by the African Union, he's once again re-engaging. He knows the actors. He knows both the President Gbagbo and Mr. Ouattara. And I think based on the history of his engagement, he knows the issues on the ground. So hopefully that will be a sound enough foundation for him then to begin to mediate between the parties. But it's a very tough job because the European Union has recognized the vote. The African Union did, as well as the United Nations. So it's a very difficult case of how do you convince President Gbagbo of either stepping down or finding some other way of seeing the country through this crisis at this point.
Absolutely. Kobe, I think what likely will be the outcome of this, and I stand to be corrected, I'm seeing echoes of Zimbabwe. I'm seeing echoes of Kenya again all over the place. Compromise. The winning guy does not get what he deserves, but in order to accommodate the incumbent, we then come to some sort of agreement. What do you see?
And I mean that's not politics at the end of the day. I mean for me that's that's a compromised position to be in. At the end of the day, for the individual. I mean if you look at Gbagbo, for instance, he's sitting in a situation where the European Union is recognizing his defeat. He's sitting with the African Union that's recognizing his defeat. He's sitting on a country which is the biggest cocoa producer globally. And you're sitting with a country that is potentially the hub for economic activity in West Africa. Now you're sitting and you're trying to derail this process. By derailing a process such as this, you're potentially just going to be sitting and slumping a country back into civil war, which is not necessarily good for anybody. And the problem is, with Western investors looking at Africa, they see Africa as one great place. So they can't discern potentially between the Ivory Coast being far away from South Africa or potentially far away from other portions of Africa. Yeah. So they kind of blanket the whole thing and they say, oh, well, there's civil unrest in Africa, so we shouldn't invest in Africa. Yeah. So all these things add to it at the end of the day. I would suggest that, therefore, I mean, I'm happy that Mbeki is in that country trying to solve these issues, because I mean, civil war is just not an option for Africa anymore. Africa's surely got to move beyond this.
Absolutely, and that it does appear like this is where it is heading. Petra, sorry, I cut you off there, but I actually wanted to get the opinion of Kobe, who's sitting here in the studio with me. Did you want to add something on that point?
Yes, sorry, the voice was very faint on my side, so I didn't realize we had another person. No, I think to underline the comment earlier is that in terms of the economic impact of a political crisis like this, we cannot underestimate it, and especially in a continent where we are poised for such incredible things to happen in terms of a rising position on the world stage, in terms of interest in the African market and resources and so forth. So therefore, we really need to find mechanisms to either force people to accept the outcome of political processes, and at the other end, to maintain stability, that we can grow the economies and look after the interests of people. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. Now, the last time we saw a dispute as big as this was, of course, in Zimbabwe, and I spoke earlier on about Kenya. But Kenyans were able to quickly get back together, and now that economy is growing again. In Zimbabwe, we looked at a decade of lost opportunity. In the case of the Ivory Coast, how many years do you think this will set the whole process of rebuilding this country and getting it to be the big economic player that it used to be?
I think the issue here is not in terms of how many years it will take. It's a case of how do you use, a sense of, how do you introduce a sense of cooperation into the political discourse in the country? Firstly, because if you don't have agreement on your basic politics, then you're not going to see economic growth. So I think the important issue here is to find that combination of a result, of a solution. A political solution will ultimately equal more economic stability and growth.
Absolutely, and we possibly may be looking at years and years of stagnation as the country remains divided between the north and the south. But importantly, what we're also seeing now are international players coming into the fore here and making their voices heard. As you have alluded to, we've got the African Union coming in and intervening, the United Nations, the United States. But regionally, what kind of an impact do you see this having on stability and also on efforts to try and get the region, the whole region to grow again?
Yes, it's Côte d'Ivoire is central, one of the many countries, on the West African coastline. And in terms of resources, access it gives to further countries inland from there. I think also in terms of other strategic oil and gas resources in the Gulf of Guinea, instability in Côte d'Ivoire will have a regional impact that, that spreads far beyond its own borders. So that's true. And secondly, also what we need to keep in mind in terms of the importance of the Ivory Coast and the political processes there is that because of the interlinkages between the societies and peoples and economic processes in the region, any conflict has an immediate ripple effect into all the other societies around it. So that's why I think the mediation effort at this point in time must, as its most important point, have not to revert to a situation of conflict. How do you prevent that? How do you get the necessary mechanisms in place now to forestall any further instability or fighting between groups of people?
I must say that's going to prove a very difficult exercise. When we were there, and that was like years and years after the end of the Civil War, you could still see signs of where the fighting took place when there was conflict. But before we let you go, let's just talk about the impact of moves that we've heard from the African Development Bank as well as the World Bank, who are now saying they are considering suspending lending to the Ivory Coast because obviously of the political situation there.
I think that's also an indication of a certain type of thinking at the level of the African Union, the African Development Bank, is to support or at least try as far as you possibly can to prevent people who co-opt power from taking the country further into ruin, and denying it access to financing is a crucial mechanism. Also in that regard, the European Union has indicated that it would consider what they call more targeted sanctions against certain figures inside Côte d'Ivoire. It's under discussion stage. So already the international powers, together with, as you said, the Development Bank and the African Union, are beginning to consider steps to isolate the country and then also to put pressure on the relevant people to remove themselves from the process if possible.
Petrus de Kock from the South African Institute of International Affairs.